basically, this project is coming from my interest in understanding how our community of scholars is starting to define and conceptualize a quality measure for media literacy competencies. The literature review is rooted in the awareness that depending on what field, discipline, point of view, or target audience you are addressing, your conceptualization of media literacy might be different from someone else's. And the literature has been accused of being fragmented because of the way that media literacy research and methods and pedagogies have been applied so broadly to so many different audiences and contexts. So the research project, the research questions that I had for this project were: how are media literacy competencies measured? How do media literacy competency measures vary as a result of disciplinary domain and intervention context? And how should media literacy competency measures be evaluated? So what I did was I picked 3 case studies from 3 different disciplines, all of which I thought used media literacy measures in a meaningful way. The first case was a study of the Facebook Tips social media campaign, which was presented to Facebook users in 2017. If you clicked on the campaign, it would take you to a list of 10 tips. And researchers tried to see whether exposure to that tips document had any influence on people's ability to judge the accuracy of headlines. And the answer is yes, it did. In the second case study, I was looking at a high school intervention created. It was in the context of smoking and media literacy, and it involved about 1,000, a little more than 1,000 ninth graders from 63 classrooms in one very large urban school district. And they were using an experimental design, they looked at whether or not media literacy learning outcomes could be demonstrated through a self-report item. And that was obviously in the context of public health. In the third case study, this was a community-based media literacy program evaluation of kind of like an internet safety or internet skills program in Hong Kong. And this was a program evaluation because the program included all kinds of different components, but they did measure media literacy competencies through a 31-item self-report measure. And so I started, as I looked at these 3 studies, and what I wanted to try to do was think about the sort of strategic choices that were being made by the researcher, and to look at the alignment between their pedagogical practices, the text, the media texts of interest, the context in which they were working and the target audience, their own goals for the project, the measures they used, and the specific domain. So you can see that the approaches to analysis that I used were based on these 3 questions. How does the design of the intervention align with the theoretical and pedagogical principles of media literacy? How does the measure align with the aims and values of the researcher? How does the pedagogy and the measure align with the texts, the target audience, and the context? And so basically what I observed was that for the GUESS study, that's the Facebook study, the domain of focus was social media, and the task was a kind of judgment based on the ability to judge the perceived accuracy of the online news media headlines. To do this kind of measure, the researchers had to identify the right answer. And participants were basically scored on, did they make the same judgments that the researchers did about the accuracy of these headlines? And that's partly because they wanted to see if the public, the Facebook users, could recognize the markers of quality that are can be found in news that's shared on social media posts. That is, they just, in their measurement, they just use social media posts presented as news. Their target audience in the context was adults in the United States and India. And when they looked at India, they looked at urban and rural India. And the pedagogy was modest. Did people click on, perhaps read, but did they click on a blog post with the 10 tips, right? So the next study, the Primac study, the high school smoking study, that study used a self-report measure of 22-item smoking media literacy scale. And what they were really doing is trying to compare a standard tobacco education curriculum to this new way of doing things, where you focus on analyzing advertising and looking at the representation of smoking in the movies, right? So they really were just trying to consider the viability of media literacy as a prevention strategy. They were focused on smoking messages in advertising and entertainment. They used high school students, and the pedagogy looked much more familiar to me, right? Not just read an article, but there were activities, there were videos to watch, and there was lots of discussion. So there, the pedagogy lined up with some of the theoretical ideas about media literacy pedagogy. In the third project from Cheng et al., the large group of folks who evaluate the BNetWise curriculum in Hong Kong, that domain was really internet education, and we might call that digital citizenship or internet safety. It goes by a bunch of different names, but there, the self-report they used was a new media literacy scale, 31 items, that really measured the ability to critically analyze online content and to create your own online content, right? It had that framework, very familiar to media literacy educators. Their aims and values were very clearly around using the internet safely and appropriately. The texts that they used were basically online texts, a lot of social media texts. They were looking at 11, 12, and 13-year-olds in Hong Kong. And here the pedagogy also looked very familiar and included activities and discussions and research projects that involved media production. So ultimately, my findings basically suggest that we have to evaluate the measures of media literacy competencies in context, as they align with the larger goals of the project. And so, because depending on your aims and values, the domain of interest or your disciplinary background and the context within you're working, a lot of different assessment measures are going to be useful to you. And really the question is, how does your measure line up with your pedagogy? In the case of the Cheng study, I argue that the alignment was not very good, right? They used a self-report measure when their pedagogy and their context maybe might have justified using a performance measure. So I guess the ultimate conclusion I came to was that research measures cannot be evaluated in a vacuum. They have to be evaluated in relation to the foundational aims of the researchers and educators who use them. And really, I recognize that the paradigm of intersubjectivity and the engagement of multiple stakeholders, we had media companies, digital platform companies, we had city governments, we had public school administrators. All of these projects involved multiple stakeholders, and the engagement of multiple stakeholders means that the distinctive approaches to measurement is, well, essentially a feature, not a bug. Media literacy educators have to use a wide variety of robust measures in relation to their aims and goals and to the many stakeholders whose work is supported by them. All right, well, thanks so much for listening. I'm Renee Hobbs, and Thanks to the International Communication Association and the IDD division for acknowledging this as a Best Poster Award. Thanks again. Bye-bye.